how do we decide whether a sector of the economy should be owned privately or publicly? This won't make much sense without the previous video, which outlines the principles we're talking about. Briefly, the principles are whether or not the sector is kind of a natural monopoly, in which case it favors public ownership. If it's not, then private. The other principle is physical survival. That's if the outputs are needed for physical survival. This favors public ownership. And if they're not and they're discretionary, then private ownership. Another principle is the percentage of the population that use the goods or services. The higher the percentage, the greater the argument in favor of public ownership. Then there is the inequity risk, and that is the greater there is a risk from private ownership creating inequity, the stronger the argument in favor of public ownership. The fifth principle is non-economic benefits, and the more that the sector produces benefits to the society that are non-financial or non-economic, the greater the argument in favor of public ownership. And the more easy it is to measure the outputs in financial terms, the stronger the argument in favor of private ownership. Those are the 5 principles, and now we have to use those to decide whether or not different sectors are publicly or privately or a mix of both or collectively owned. Let's use some examples. Broadly speaking, sectors should be publicly owned if they involve natural monopolies producing things needed by everyone for their physical survival, and severe inequitable outcomes would result from private ownership. On the other hand, sectors could be privately owned if they are highly competitive, produce discretionary goods or services that are used by very few people, and there would be very trivial inequity outcomes resulting from private ownership. Those are 2 very general models, of course, and many of the sectors of the economy are going to fall somewhere in the middle. So for certain pairs of fulfilled or unfulfilled economic principles of ownership, it's going to be relatively easy to decide between public and private ownership. For example, sectors that entail natural monopolies producing things that are needed for survival should probably be controlled by publicly owned enterprises, even if the outputs from that sector are only used by some people. Similarly, sectors that are producing things needed for physical survival that cannot be easily measured in financial terms should probably be publicly owned, even if they do not entail a natural monopoly. So this is where we look at different pairings of the principles applied and decide whether or not things are publicly or privately owned. In reality, we would want to take into consideration all 5 principles simultaneously, and so each one becomes a bit of an exercise in balancing the principles that are at stake here. And there's probably a lot of work to be done in developing the systems to apply these principles. On the other hand, sectors that are highly competitive and produce discretionary goods or services should be privately owned, even if everyone uses those things. Another example is that sectors producing discretionary items where there are very little or no risk of inequitable outcomes should probably be privately owned as well, even if everyone uses those outputs. Sectors where the different ownership principles are partially fulfilled are probably suitable for a mix in the type of ownership. For example, sectors that are almost natural monopolies or produce outputs that are crucial but not strictly needed for physical survival, or maybe they are used by most people, by not everyone. Perhaps they create some inequity, but it's not very severe. Or maybe the sector's outputs include both economic and non-economic benefits. These sectors where the principles don't clearly apply and they're somewhere in the middle between the 2 extremes for each principle are ideal for having a mix of enterprises, some being private, some being public. And it's important that these sectors probably have at least one publicly owned enterprise operating alongside the private enterprises. And there's room also for cooperative, worker-owned enterprises in these sectors. Having publicly owned enterprises keeps price gouging under control, while having private and cooperative enterprises in the sector increases the options that are available to people, and perhaps leaves room for greater customer service and innovation. The degree to which different ownership types will control a sector should be determined by the degree to which the different principles of ownership are fulfilled within that sector. The closer a sector is to being a natural monopoly, the more its outputs are needed for physical survival, the higher the proportion of people in society that use the outputs from that sector, the greater the risk of inequity from having it privately owned, and the more that the benefits are non-economic, the stronger the argument is in favor of having public ownership in that sector. On the other hand, The more competitive a sector is and the easier it is for new players to enter the market, the more discretionary or luxury or non-necessary its outputs are, the fewer the people that are using its outputs, and the lower the risk there is of inequity from there being private ownership, and the easier it is for the outputs to be measured in financial or economic terms, the stronger the argument is in favor of having more private ownership in that sector. We have to apply all the principles simultaneously and come to a conclusion for each sector about whether it should be completely private, completely public, or a mix of public, private, cooperative, or just cooperative. And the risks and benefits to society are part of the calculation. Applying one ownership type to the entire economy doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for everything to be privately owned because that produces a great deal of harm to society as a whole. We'll have monopolies, we'll have price gouging, lack of competition, and overall it will be a very inequitable society. On the other hand, if you had everything owned by the state, then the number of choices in different sectors is probably going to decrease, especially in competitive discretionary sectors, and the options available to people is going to be fewer. Innovation might be less because if they're not necessary, then it doesn't make sense to dedicate public resources to non-necessary items when there's poverty and things like that. Ideological arguments of people who are 100% supporting of capitalism or 100% supportive of socialism or communism don't make sense, in my opinion, to apply to the entire economy. We have to look at the outputs, the goods and services from that sector of the economy to decide on whether that sector should be owned publicly, privately, or in some mix of the two. These principles, these 5 principles, help determine whether or not that sector should be owned publicly, privately, or a mix of the two. If we apply that to a number of different industries and sectors, we might be able to create a society that serves the needs of everyone and has better outcomes for everyone.